Hello, and welcome to Exploring Axon, a podcast where we discuss Axon Framework, Axon Server, and their ecosystem. I am your host and a software developer at Axonic, Sara. Welcome to the second part of my talk with my colleagues Steven van Beelen and Dugalic on message designs and message-driven architecture. I hope you enjoy our conversation, and let's have a listen. So before we get to the evolution, let's talk about compatibility. So for instance, we want to use a serialized format, and we wanted to basically be at some point backward compatible or forward compatible, because we're thinking about what we did in the past. We're thinking about what we want to get in the future. So this is all coming down to, designing these different components, right? How do you go along with that? And what is, before that though, I guess, can one of you, either is fine, explain what is backward compatible, what is forward compatible, and do we have other types of backward compatibility? Steven, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I think I can, but I also know that Ivan has a very, very good idea of this. So let's pair up on
You
this
both
once
can
more,
share.
Ivan.
Yeah, of
I think
course.
that's a smart move. I'll start though. Whenever you so this compatibility angle really, or well, way, how do you call that? Backward or forward, or not at all, who knows, or maybe
Right.
both sides, who knows. That really only comes into play if you have a finalized version of something.
Right.
So if you have a format of your event or command or query, your message, that is in existence forever or might be used by something, only then would it really be of importance to think of this, or that there is a certain scope that you have several versions of a schema, in essence. So that adds another interesting layer we could come to later. But as we're doing events, and we are, well, I assume the majority of the listeners also enjoys using event sourcing, you have that event store. So you have every type of every event till the end of time. So especially when it comes to events, the idea of versioning is very important, and thinking of that compatibility.
Yeah.
For commands and queries, this is a bit different, because you're not always dealing with an amount of command versions or query versions. The only case that would be happening is if you have, or if you're running an application handling a specific type of command for all the versions it has ever existed in. So let's assume I'm building a flight application. It can handle the cancel flight command, and that cancel flight command has changed for every version of my flight application, and I'm running all those versions concurrently. Only then would the publisher of the cancel flight command be required to have a schema that works in any direction.
Right.
So similar for queries, by the way. Now, having said all that, we can think about being backward or forward compatible. Being backward compatible means that a newer version of a message can go back to the previous format. And forward is the other way around.
And I think it's
putting it very
worth
simple.
mentioning. Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning though, backward, as you said, and this was something that didn't click with me the first time I read about backward and forward, was that it's compatible with one previous version, not all of the previous versions, right? Because that's another type of backward compatibility, is basically backward transitive. Is that what it was? Yeah. Backward transitive. I think that's
one.
Okay.
Yeah. For me, that was a new concept I actually also got from Ivan, and I found it it makes sense, because I always thought of it from one jump. But yeah, of course, yeah, makes total sense.
Which was really great to know also, because initially when I thought about backward compatible, it was it's compatible with all of the previous versions, but it was, I guess, not true. It was just compatible with one previous version. If you're in version, 3 versions behind, then it's not gonna work, right? You have to have a different type there. So thanks, Yvonne, for that. We learned something valuable.
No problem. I'm glad. I mean, it's a little bit difficult when you explain backward compatibility for, let's say, event sourcing aggregate, right? This is a
Mm,
really special case because we have two dimensions there. Usually in CRUD systems, we have always like a dimension of time, obviously, but in CRUD systems, the dimension of space is more, we are more focused on that dimension, right? Because usually have like two components. One is the producer of the API, like for example, aggregate that is publishing an event, and the other component is just a consumer of that event, right? And you see them; they are distributed across the space, right? One is left and the other is right, right? So and now, if you, it's much better to explain maybe backward compatibility in this example. Then later on, I might introduce an aggregate and time concept because it's very interesting, right? So, but now let's focus on this simple one.
yeah.
So yeah, as Stephen mentioned, like backward compatibility is it means that consumer using the new schema can read data produced with the last schema, right? So what that really means. So in this case, aggregate that I just previously mentioned, owner of the API, owner of these events, right? Will change the event, let's say by deleting some of the attributes from it. Let's say one, right? Uh, and now my downstream application, which is subscribing to these events, is in trouble because maybe I need that attribute and I want to do something smart with it, but I don't have it anymore. So, but essentially, deleting the attributes, at least for Avro and for JSON schemas, they're very similar in these rules. It's actually a backward compatible change. So this is good. This really means now I can deploy my consumer first, right? I can even do that with zero downtime. Let's say if I have two instances of this consumer application running at the same time, I can introduce something like blue grid deployment or canary releasing, rolling upgrades in general, whatever you like to call it. Deploy first application, first instance with the new schema. Right now, I introduce this change first on the consumer side because this was backward compatible change actually. So I'm able to do that. Then deploy the second instance, all zero data. Because remember, it can work with old events and with new schema of events perfectly. So that's the reason why you should probably, if the change is backward compatible, you should deploy your consumer first, and then you can deploy your producer as well later on, all zero downtime. So if your change is backward compatible, you are my hero because this will enable more flexible deployment strategies, which are essential and important, especially in distributed systems, because we have like many of these applications scattered all around, and you really want to enable easy and flexible deployment with zero downtime if possible. If your change is backward compatible, this will enable exactly that. Forward
Right.
compatibility is also very nice. It means that if your change is also forward compatible, then it will not break your consumer at all. So, but usually, if the change is only forward compatible, you can deploy producer of the API first, and then deploy consumer of that API as a second, also with zero downtime. If your change
Yeah.
is forward and backward compatible, you are super cool, super nice. So
You're
my idea
golden.
is, yeah, my idea is that you are aware of these rules. So I respect teams that invest some time in actually thinking about this,
Yeah.
knowing this upfront. In this case, it can help you, make sure that you try to satisfy this rule whenever it's possible. And you will be
Yeah.
surprised. In most of the occasions, it will be actually possible to do so. So whenever you change your events, let's try to change them in a way so they're at least backward or maybe forward compatible or maybe both. If that's not possible, fine, we know about it. Let's figure it out how to handle these situations where this is actually not possible. So I guess,
Yeah.
does it make sense, Sarah,
Yeah,
or maybe not?
absolutely. And Stephen, I'm so sorry I cut you off while you were explaining the compatibilities. But if you
No
wanted to
worries.
add something to
No,
that,
no.
yeah, please.
Well, if I'd be, yeah, well, I'm thinking. So we do add a portion of this in the training as well, because it is
Mm-hmm.
important.
Yeah.
Whenever you're making a message-driven system like you do with Axon Framework and Axon Server, you
Mm-hmm.
automatically come to a stance. Okay, I'm running in production. I've got this version of my messages. I'm going to the second. How I'm going to solve this? How do I keep compatibility?
Right.
And I always try to end that. Please be backward and forward. Sure,
Mm-hmm.
Yvonne has a point. You can't always do that, but there are plenty of scenarios where I think you have that flexibility. I hope. One tiny thing I would add to this is that as Axon itself doesn't enforce schemas from a registry, right? So even though we
Yeah.
have a Jackson serializer, it has no connection to a Jackson schema whatsoever. I
Mm-hmm.
know that Avro serializer from Jan and Simon, or the one they were working on,
You do have to.
does that to
Yeah.
some extent. Yes,
Right.
that's just a requirement in those cases because
Yeah.
that's how Avro works. Um,
Yes.
so real enforcement of those schemas is different. It becomes more an implicit schema rather than an explicit in a lot of the scenarios because it's the class format that dictates how to serialize or deserialize it.
Right.
So again, the serialization here is important to actually be able to deal with messages from the past that have fields in an old way that you no longer care about because you have a new version of the actual class. This
Yeah.
requires your serializer to be able to ignore those things. We tend to call this lenient serialization. The framework actually has options for the Extreme and Jackson implementations to automatically make those lenient for this exact purpose.
Okay.
So
Nice.
that again, to iterate, so that the Extreme serializer or the Jackson serializer just ignores unknown elements, so
Mm-hmm.
that well, your old applications can deal with the new format of the messages, which has new
It
fields that they don't know about and shouldn't break serialization.
and it doesn't care about that. Yeah. Yeah. Which is
Yeah.
really interesting. Nice. So one thing that you both put quite a bit of emphasis on, and I think it's really, really important to talk about, is the design of your schema and how can we minimize the necessity to change the messages in the future, probably, right? How can we well, of course, obviously, things as your application grows and requirements change, you have to change things, fine. But can we minimize those changes? Can we start somewhere that gives you somewhat of a safe space that you can say, okay, cool, we take this design. Of course, we want it to be backward, forward compatible. How do we basically approach this? How do we design for different scenarios?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Yeah, so yeah, as you mentioned, Sarah, I like to try to be backward or forward or both compatible if possible. In order to do so, you can also utilize something like consumer-driven testing at first, right? So at least the producer of the API would be informed at the beginning of the process when they introduce the change in their own system. They will immediately know, which clients they're breaking, right? Or maybe they're breaking backward, or maybe they're breaking forward compatibility. So there are a couple of tools that can actually be used to and be introduced in your continuous integration process as tests that can provide you with this information. This is very valuable information because based on that info, you can choose either to continue breaking them and then introduce some sort of versioning and version your libraries because you're breaking at least one of the clients in your portfolio. If you're not breaking anybody, then why bother actually introducing a major version? You can just upgrade a minor version or just a patch, right? So it can be a very nice input for also introducing some sort of like versioning strategy within your landscape of systems, right? It's very
Mhm.
nice input to it. So consumer-driven testing is the first thing I consider, like at least between the systems, between the bounded contexts. maybe it would be too much to introduce such a testing for services within one bounded context because they're managed with one team. Usually, we can communicate these API changes within one team, within one bound context, but this is not really easy to do if we are integrating two systems that are also two bounded contexts, right? Usually they're managed by two teams. They can be, geographically or mentally, totally two different teams, far, far away from each other. And I like to have something like formal representation of that contract as a test in my source code. So I realize when my change in the API schema is going to affect any of these clients.
Hmm.
That's what consumer-driven contracts really are, right? So that's
Yeah.
the first thing I consider. Obviously, I always try to be backward and forward compatible, but this is the tool exactly that will tell me, hey, you're not doing this in a backward compatible way, or you're not doing this in a forward compatible way. So you need some tools that can actually alert you that your change is not good enough, maybe, right? But when
Yeah.
you realize, okay, uh, I have to I have to break it, right? So I'm not able to be backward compatible. That's fair.
Yeah.
Yes, it will happen. Then how can you help yourself, right? So what you need to do to tackle down these kind of situations, right? Well, first of all, you can minimize chances for this to happen by, let's say, uh, designing your events, structuring your events in a simple way. So let's say use primitive attributes there. Simple thing, right? For example, use integers, longs, strings, rather than complex value objects, right? Because if you have like a complex value object, it tends to change, right? So it
Yeah.
also tends to be shared with other
Hmm.
APIs, right? And then you can easily end up in a shared language situation, right? Because you're sharing a lot of these value objects between different APIs that belong to different services. I mean, if you're not careful, this can actually happen, and it was happening to me. It was too.
Oh, and
I
I'm
saw that.
chuckling because this literally happened to my team a couple of months ago. Where we
Yes, yes,
decided instead of using a string for an attribute, we decided to use value object, and that was okay at the beginning. But once things started growing, then we realized that, oh, this is becoming a really big problem. So then
yeah,
we had to go back, talking about design, we had to go back and redesign things because now we were talking about upstream and downstream and what was affecting something else. One module
right,
was affecting another module that we didn't initially thoroughly think about. And once things started growing in different directions, and then we realized that, oh, this is not going to
yeah.
work. Then we had to
Mhm.
go back and redesign everything and basically redo a good 4 weeks of work. But that's
Yeah.
that's how it goes sometimes. Yeah.
If you really need to use these value objects within your messages, I would like to keep them decoupled and not used by aggregate, for example. So it's very
Hmm.
convenient, and this is why we are making that mistake usually because it's convenient, right? So you can
Yeah.
do that, then you will probably do that. And if you're in such a situation, then your event API, for example, if your event is sharing some value object, let's say address, or
Yeah.
it's a common value object, right? And you tend to share that, have that in your aggregate and your event. So it's the same address class, right, that you're sharing there.
Yeah.
Uh, Now, how can you evolve, let's say, your event message API, but not really also changing your aggregate, right? So you cannot do that anymore. So whenever you might change, that value object from the perspective of the aggregate because you need to change that class there, but essentially it will change the API, the event itself as well because the object is
Exactly.
shared. So this is in this case you're restricting yourself in a way to evolve your API in a more autonomous way. So if these messages are not sharing this value object between them, then you would be able to autonomously evolve them as well in a better way. So that's my biggest assumption and that I have in regarding how you should be structuring your messages, events, commands, and queries, right? This applies to all three of them.
Yeah.
It's just the dry principle So don't repeat
Right.
yourself. That is biting ourselves in the ass most cases.
Right.
Because you think as
Exactly.
you think as a developer, oh, I got this nice value object containing the product IDs, the prices, a set of
Yeah.
orders, the name, the title. Yeah, I can use this in the command, and then I'll store it in the aggregate, and then I publish it in the event, and I use it in my query models in several
Hmm.
projections. Now one of those things changes. Now you have to change everything. It's essentially that value object coupled everything with one another.
It's
And
literally what
if
happened to us.
yeah, if that
Really
exact
by this.
object is, yeah, that just happens. I've also been in that space. You know,
Yeah.
we are used to not repeat ourselves. That's what we've been told to do. That's what the
Hmm.
majority of developers say you should be doing. But
Yeah.
when it comes to these, well, your API, well, I think it's a bit different. And these messages are your API. So
Right.
use that sparingly. Do that translation step. It might feel cumbersome and redundant at first, but you can make it as fine tuned as you like. But using flat types, primitive types like Ivan shared, I would also recommend that. That's just the way to go. Um, I think simple, common value objects are debatable. So I can imagine that an address, the sample you used, Ivan, might not change that often. Well, depending on maybe your
Unless
company
you're
is just
Sarah and you move a lot.
exactly. That's the
And
point I
she
wanted
just
to make. An address from the perspective of the Netherlands can be entirely different from what it is in Serbia or in the US. So if your
yeah.
company all of a sudden moves from being a Dutch based application
Mhm.
to worldwide, then you do need to
Right.
change that common value object still. So
Hmm.
yeah, being very protective about that is smart. It's not so different from what you would teach people to do when it comes to a bounded context.
Right.
You would do translation. You would do that, what they call context mapping. You'd map from what you get to what you want it to be on your end.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, good that you
Makes
mentioned
sense.
dry principle. So don't repeat yourself. Really doesn't
Yeah,
work almost never in a good way, especially in event-driven and message-driven systems. So we don't
Yeah.
tend to share value objects between our messages and aggregates and other components. As well, we don't like to share our models between different bounded contexts. So
no,
we have, no. So we just model them differently. So you can have like a product as an aggregate in one context, and you can have a product as an aggregate in another context, and you model them as two different classes because most probably they will be doing the different things and they have different meanings there. So let's do that extra step and extra mile, right? And model them as they should be modeled autonomously. So that's the point. And you fractally do that on every level. So I mean, as much as you
correct.
can to decouple things,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah. Makes sense. So we did touch a little bit on what if something is not backward compatible and what if you do need to change, and we mentioned versioning. And Stephen, I'm going to come back to this favorite topic of mine, which is upcasters. Can you use
Yeah.
upcasters?
Well, yes. Yeah. Why not?
No.
Yeah. In a lot of scenarios, you can. It's just, and I feel this is somewhat of a misser still when it comes to the actual framework. The upcaster support is mainly focused around events.
Hmm.
Granted, this is where the heavyweight lies. Like I pointed out, you won't be parting from your version 0 of an event, even if you're at version 20 or 30 or 40, you'd still have those old versions.
Right.
So if the backward and forward compatibility, transitive or not, doesn't work all the way throughout, then having an upcaster that actually changes from one version to another, just one version to one other version, right? Not
Yeah.
jump several steps,
Right. Right.
is going to be smart.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's right now not easily supported for commands or queries, and I'd very much like to change that in a future version. It's
Hint,
only
hint.
reasonable.
Contributors.
Exactly. A contribution would be very much appreciated, but I can imagine this is a bit
Yeah,
too
of
too
course.
much in the internals.
It's a big one. It's a big
Nonetheless,
one.
everybody is welcome.
I meant internal and external control. Right?
Oh,
We
are you
can
going
all
to contribute, Sarah?
play. Oh God! Don't even get me started. I think not at the moment, but yeah, that's definitely something
Yeah,
that I'm
but
interested in
upcasters are really
seeing
interesting
and
concepts we
creating.
have in Exxon framework. So this is
Yeah.
really helpful and interesting concept that you guys can use. Because if you are breaking backward compatibility, you most probably need to introduce an upcaster to handle that situation, right? And then you're done. I mentioned before, like aggregates are very special components. They are special because they're producers of the API, so they're producing events as well, right? But they're also consuming the same events. But now distribution is not on the space dimension, right? Now only dimension is time. So this is one single aggregate component we are talking about, but now we are only distributed across the timeline, right? Because uh, aggregate will need to read, I mean, I'm talking about event sourcing. It will need to read all of these past events it previously published, right? So these are the same event it published, right? Now it's reading them to construct its own state, but this is actually putting your aggregate to be a producer of the API and a consumer of the same event he previously published, right? And only dimension here is time. And sometimes this is not obvious because we are missing the dimension of space, right? These are not two different components left and right, and it's not anymore obvious, but still you have the same trouble. So you have to take care of backward compatibility. Right? Nevertheless, this is the same component, reading its own events, right? You're still in trouble and have to take care of that backward compatibility. If you're not able to do so, then you can squeeze an mapcaster. Essentially, it's like a filter, it's like a component sitting somewhere between your desirable schema and the serializer, and squeezing some default values or whatever you really want to do with that. So it's your responsibility to create an upcaster and to register that upcaster on the aggregate. So even if your change is not backward compatible, it will able to handle this situation in an easy way, making sure that your aggregate will not throw an exception because it cannot understand some old schema of the event sitting in the store for a year, right? And now you have the new schema, you deploy new aggregate now, and it doesn't understand that old schema, upcasters will help you to understand. Like it will translate it from one schema to another, from one version to another. And that's why we call it an upcaster. And for
Yeah.
that reason, we also have this annotation in Exxon Framework, so you can annotate your event with a revision. Please,
Yeah.
Stephen, if I'm not correct, prove me otherwise. But I guess there is like a revision annotation there. So Upcaster will actually move that event from revision 1 to revision 2, for example. So
Mhm. Yes.
No, that's correct, Ivan. You got a revision annotation you could add to your messages, which is taken into consideration by the serializer. So the
yes,
serializer would see that annotation on the class and would retrieve the field from the annotation and add that as part of the type, of the serialized type. I can make it a bit more specific, and I'm diving into details, but I'm going to do regardless. The
Go ahead.
serializer actually uses revision resolver, which is an interface, of which the default implementation is an annotation-based revision resolver using the revision annotation. But you can do a revision resolver on whatever you like. You got the freedom.
yeah, yeah.
However, the recommended and simplest and less work for the user is just use that revision annotation. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So we,
And sorry, Sarah, just
yeah,
to
go ahead. No, go for it,
wrap this
Ivan.
up, I was also
Yeah, of
asking
course.
Steven, I guess, some time ago. So we have this subcaster, and somehow I thought this is just for any aggregate, right? But as I mentioned, aggregate is not the only component that has to take care of backward and forward compatibility,
Right.
right? What if these are like two components, now arranged in space, like two different components, and then let's think about event handler downstream subscribing to that event, right? It's not aggregate itself, but now it's in the additional event handler, right? So, and it was like a breaking change. So it was not a backward compatible change we introduced within that event. So now we are in trouble on the query side. So this event handler is in trouble. Can we use this same upcaster, right? And use it on the query side on an event handler component and help ourselves and so to deal with this breaking change, Stephen? Do you know? Is this possible?
Yeah, sure. Those upcasters are essentially attached to the message source that is being used. So, well, in the majority of cases, that is the event store. So, whenever you provide upcasters and register them with Axon's configurer or in the Spring Boot fashion, make them simple part of the application context, they will be wired to that message source. So, and it's that message source that both aggregates use to event source themselves and event processors use to handle events. So, both the command side and query side are safe if you have those upcasters.
Mhm.
What's important, though, as a nice addition, I think, to this, that in essence makes the upcasters almost part of the API. It is the owner of that message should provide that upcaster to whomever requires it because they're ingesting that message. This might feel off, but if you take it to the perspective of things like Avro or Protobuf, those schema solutions also impose on you that you are mindful of backward and forward compatibility, imposing how that change is being made, essentially being that upcasting process. So it doesn't, to me at least, that idea, that analogy makes it less weird to have an actual upcaster as an implementation from some framework. Well, in this case, ours, but for the sake of reasoning, let's call it some framework. Make that part of your messaging API. That might feel off, but it isn't. It's what those schemas do as well.
Mhm. That's really interesting. I never thought about it that way. That's
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah, that
really
makes a lot of
interesting. Yeah,
sense.
that's pretty
That
cool.
makes a
Yeah,
lot of
makes sense.
sense. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, this is a big topic that I think we can talk about for days. Even
Yes.
one thing that and I know we covered a lot, and I know that there are possible. I'm not sure if there are plans exactly. Stephen, you know this more than I do. That we did initially talk about events being immutable, and we don't want to change them or whatever in the future.
Mm-hmm.
However, there is a need sometimes, especially when it comes to security reasons and so forth,
Yep.
that you do need to make changes to events in the future. And I will come back to it probably with a separate talk with either just you or both the two of you if you were interested in that conversation. Is how can we change events? Is that something that it's in the process of talking right now, implementation? Do you guys have any ideas of how you want to um, tackle this? Should we even
So,
talk about it?
so we even talk. I'm fine with expanding this podcast to cover that topic as well. No worries.
Okay. Depends on how long do
My,
you need.
yeah, exactly. That's well, good point. I've actually been there. I've worked on a project where we had taken the stance that, okay, we have these old versions, we don't care about them anymore. We need to
Hmm,
move to the latest version. Um, well, we were very diligent about our upcasters. We always made those.
right.
So you can actually use those upcasters to read the old format, make the new
Hmm.
one. But instead of just doing that ad hoc every time, like the framework does, the
Right.
upcasted result is then stored in just another event store.
Hmm.
And I understand that that mitigates from the theory saying that you never change your events.
Yeah.
Yes, I know. But I think it's good to be pragmatic sometimes.
Right. That makes
Yes,
sense.
indeed. It makes sense.
That makes sense. Awesome. Any other points you guys like to mention
I
before
mean,
we wrap up
there
the
are a couple of
conversation?
initiatives. I mean, I just want to mention that all of this is pretty much new. I mean, not only to me, but to everybody. I mean, we are used to having this REST architecture and RESTful endpoints that we are consuming, graph, QL, flavored endpoints, mostly sync, right? I'm reading my own writes, right? So way
Right.
of communicating. But when we talk about messaging API, it's still quite new, as we realized during this meeting and this session.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of initiatives. Async API, for example, is just one of them. I guess that we are also trying to engage with them and to, I don't know, to learn and push this. We need more tooling. Like we need probably more standards around this topic. I guess this is my thoughts around it. So we are still young in regarding to how much tooling we actually have to control the situation in a better way. So
Yeah.
it's also, for me, it's also very important feedback that we get from clients and customers, right? Because we now learn what they really need. Because when I'm done with the project, I stay, maintaining that project after some while and helping them, build it, you run it. So that's my mantra as well. But I cannot stay for indefinite time with them, and then usually they feel that pain later on. But before they do, we actually want to talk about that and get that feedback from them, so we can create that tooling, or actually we can influence even on the standards that are going to be created in the future. So that's
Yeah.
it's very important, the feedback we received from our customers, clients, and partners, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Right. So lots of, I think, designing and lots of thought that has to go through all of this, and it poses a lot of challenges because we're talking about doing things asynchronously, which is not always comfortable. And a lot of times when we talk about eventual consistency and things like that, that are in the younger stage of the conversation. So as we go on, we improve, and we just had a different topic that we were discussing before we started recording, which is, things are never perfect, but you just improve on them as you go and as you learn more about them. So I think that's just where we are. We're in the state of improvement, and
Yeah.
of course, feedback is always appreciated. But I really want to thank you both for spending your part of your Friday afternoon, evening-ish now, with me, and really diving a little bit deeper into some of these topics that we frequently get questions on. And some of them are very complex, and there's no easy answer to them. But at least this hopefully will give the users a bit of uh, more of an in-depth understanding and tools that they can use to improve their own applications and use some of these concepts a bit better in their systems. So I really want to thank you both for spending the time and explaining things to me and others. Really appreciate it. With that, we'll come back with other topics next time, and I wish you both a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Sarah. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
And Ivan, of course.
Always
This
a
was
pleasure.
exactly always a pleasure. This was very nice.
Thank you both.
And,
Thank you, Steven.
All right,
talk to you
until next
time.
time. Yeah.
Till next
bye-bye.
time. See you around.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Steven and Ivan. Join me next time as I speak with other wonderful guests on other fascinating topics. Until then, have a great time and happy coding!